The bustling noise of the airport terminal seemed to fade into the background as Jaden Williams wandered aimlessly. His sneakers scuffed against the polished floor, his backpack bouncing lightly on his back with each step. He had always found the airport to be an exciting place, a place full of possibilities. The hum of announcements over the PA system, the long rows of passengers waiting for their flights, and the occasional distant roar of a plane taking off from the runway, it all felt like a world of its own. At 12 years old, Jaden was at the age where everything felt bigger than it actually was. The world seemed full of endless opportunities, and he couldn't help but daydream about the future, a future where he might fly planes, just like his father, Derek Williams, the FAA administrator. Derek wasn't just any dad, he was someone who commanded respect in the world of aviation, someone whose voice could shape the future of the skies. For Jaden, that made him feel both proud and, at times, distant. But today, the airport felt different. There was an unease in the air, like something was about to happen. The energy in the terminal shifted, and Jaden could feel it creeping under his skin. His eyes darted from one place to another, as he tried to shake off the strange feeling. As Jaden wandered deeper into the terminal, he found himself near a restricted area. His curiosity led him past the velvet ropes, drawn by the sight of a large aircraft being prepped for departure. He could hear the mechanical hum of the engine starting up and the voices of the ground crew as they worked to ready the plane. He had seen his father around these planes countless times, but today, standing just a few feet from the jet, he felt like he was witnessing something magical. But what Jaden didn't realize was that he had crossed into an area he wasn't supposed to be. Captain Stevens, a seasoned pilot in his mid-40s, had just finished his pre-flight checks and was heading toward the cockpit. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed Jaden standing near the restricted zone, looking more curious than cautious. Captain Stevens furrowed his brow. Something about the boy's presence felt off. It wasn't that Jaden looked suspicious, far from it. He was just a kid, staring wide-eyed at the planes. But the unease that had been building all morning seemed to peak now. His instincts told him something wasn't right. He didn't know why, but his gut told him to act fast. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his phone and dialed airport security. "Yes, I have a young boy near the restricted area. He's not supposed to be there, and I don't feel right about this. You need to send someone down here immediately." Jaden had no idea what was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong, or so he thought. As he continued to watch the plane, the door to the restricted area opened, and two airport security officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and official. "Hey, kid," one of them called out, walking toward him. "What are you doing here?" Jaden froze, his heart pounding. He glanced over his shoulder, feeling the growing heat in his chest. He didn't know what was going on, but the stern look on the security officer's face made his stomach tighten. I'm just looking at the planes," Jaden said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "I didn't mean any harm." The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing. A second security guard had now joined them, and within moments, the situation escalated. The officers were speaking to each other, exchanging words Jaden couldn't fully hear. But then one of them pulled out a radio and began speaking into it. "This is Unit 3. We've got a kid here in the restricted area. He doesn't have a pass or any identification." The voice on the other end of the radio responded, a clear sign that something more was happening. Jaden's mind raced. Why were they treating him like this? He was just a kid. What had he done wrong? Before he could even process it fully, a few minutes later, a police officer arrived, flanked by two more airport security personnel. The officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression, walked up to Jaden and took a long look at him. "You're under suspicion for trespassing in a restricted area," the officer said in a matter-of-fact tone. "We need to talk to your parents." Jaden's heart sank. His mind flashed to his dad, to Derek, and the anger that would surely follow when he found out. His dad was an important man in aviation, someone who would expect him to understand the boundaries, to stay within the rules. But Jayden didn't mean to break any rules. He just wanted to see the planes up close. His father had always talked about the magic of flying, about the importance of the work he did. Jayden had always dreamed of being part of that world, and now, somehow, he felt like an intruder in it. But before the situation could spiral further, something unexpected happened. Captain Stevens, who had made the original call to security, approached the group. He didn't smile or offer any comfort, he simply stood, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The officers nodded at him in acknowledgement, and Jayden could see the way they all treated the pilot like someone with authority, someone whose opinion mattered. And in that moment, Jayden realized just how much weight Captain Stevens' word carried. "Why did you call the police on me?" Jayden asked, his voice a mix of frustration and confusion. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." Captain Stevens looked down at Jayden, his expression unreadable. "It's not about what you were doing, son," he said curtly. "It's about the fact that you were in a restricted area where you shouldn't have been. That's all." Jayden's confusion turned to anger. He didn't understand why everything had gone so wrong so quickly. It wasn't like he was causing trouble. He was just a kid looking at planes. But the adults around him saw him differently. The fear in their eyes, the tension in their movements, it wasn't just about the rules anymore. Something else was at play. And just as quickly as the officers had arrived, they left. Jayden was escorted out of the area, his heart still racing, his mind reeling with questions. Why had everything spiraled out of control so fast? And what would happen now? As he walked away, feeling a mixture of shame and frustration, Jayden couldn't help but wonder, what would the world think of him now? As if reading his mind, one of the officers turned to him, still keeping a stern expression. "We'll be contacting your parents," he said. "Just remember next time, the rules apply to everyone." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jayden had always felt like a little fish in a big pond. Growing up in a suburban neighborhood with neatly manicured lawns and quiet streets, he often felt like he was living in the shadow of something much larger than himself, something that made him feel both proud and, at times, alienated. That something was his father, Derek Williams, the FAA administrator, a man who commanded respect in the world of aviation. As the FAA administrator, Derek was a figure many people looked up to. He was a man whose decisions shaped the way the entire country's air travel system worked. He didn't just fly on planes, he was responsible for the rules, the regulations, and the safety measures that affected millions of lives every day. But even though Derek was a giant in his field, it wasn't always easy for Jayden to see him as just his dad. For as long as Jayden could remember, his father's career had been a distant entity in their home. Derek was often away on business trips, attending meetings, or giving speeches at conferences. When he was home, he was exhausted, consumed by the weight of his responsibilities. His conversations were usually about work, about air traffic control, security regulations, or airline policies. It wasn't that Jayden didn't respect his father, it was just hard to connect with a man who lived in a world so far removed from his own. Jayden's mother, Monica, had always been there for him, balancing the emotional weight of their family. She was the one who showed up at every parent-teacher conference, who made sure he was fed and clothed, and who listened to his dreams of becoming a pilot one day. While Derek was a man of authority in the public eye, Monica was the heart of their family. She was the one who listened to Jayden's frustrations, who held him when he was upset, and who reassured him that everything would be okay, even when things didn't always feel okay. Despite the distance between Jayden and his father, he admired Derek's work. Aviation had always been a part of their family, from the books about airplanes that Derek kept on his shelves to the models of various aircraft that dotted their home. Jayden had always been drawn to the skies. He spent hours watching planes take off from the airport near their house, his mind filled with wonder at the thought of one day being in the cockpit, soaring above the clouds, just like his dad. But there was one thing Jayden couldn't ignore: the way people saw him. They didn't see him as Derek Williams' son, they saw him as a black boy. It was a reality that Jayden had learned to navigate, but it wasn't always easy. He couldn't escape the feeling that the world judged him differently because of the color of his skin. He didn't have to look too far to see the subtle stares, the whispers, and the assumptions made about him. At school, Jayden did his best to blend in. He was a good student, smart and inquisitive, but there were times when he felt like he was trying too hard to prove himself. He wasn't just the kid with a famous dad, he was the kid who had to work harder to be noticed for who he really was. And sometimes, it felt like nothing he did could erase the labels that others had already put on him. Then there was the fact that Derek's high-profile position often made their family the center of attention. Jayden's friends thought it was cool that his dad worked for the FAA. They marveled at the stories he would tell about his father's meetings with airline executives and the regulations his dad helped put in place. But that admiration was always accompanied by a certain level of detachment, a subtle reminder that Jayden's world was different from theirs. The relationship between Jayden and his father had always been complicated. Derek, while caring, often seemed distant, as if his mind was always somewhere else. He would tell Jayden how important it was to follow the rules, to be disciplined, to pursue excellence. But Jayden wanted more than just advice. He wanted a connection, a bond that went beyond the world of aviation and rules. He wanted his father to understand him, to see him for who he was outside of the title he held at work. Jayden would often lie awake at night, staring out of his bedroom window at the stars, wondering if he could ever be more than just a shadow in his father's world. Could he be more than just the kid of the FAA administrator? Could he make his own mark in a world that sometimes seemed set against him? Despite these struggles, there were moments of genuine joy in Jayden's life. Monica always made sure that, even when Derek was busy, they had family time together. They would go to baseball games, have movie nights, and take weekend trips. Those moments, though rare, were the ones Jayden cherished the most. It was during these times that he felt seen and heard, not as the child of someone important, but as Jayden, a young boy with dreams and hopes just like any other. But even during these small moments of peace, there was always a nagging feeling at the back of Jayden's mind. It wasn't just about his father's absence or the pressure to live up to expectations, it was about the world he had to navigate every day. A world that saw him through the lens of race, that made him feel as if he had to work twice as hard just to be treated equally. As Jayden stood at the airport that fateful day, the weight of all these thoughts pressed down on him. He had never imagined that a simple visit to watch planes take off would lead to a situation that would make everything come crashing down. Little did Jayden know, the world he had been quietly navigating was about to change forever. The incident at the airport would not only shake the foundation of his relationship with his father but would force him to confront the realities of race, authority, and identity in ways he never expected. The airport, once a place of fascination and dreams, had become a symbol of something much darker. And Jayden was caught right in the middle of it. Jayden's heart raced as he sat in the small, sterile airport security office. The walls were white, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him. He wasn't used to being in a place like this. His body felt heavy, the kind of heavy that made it hard to think clearly. He hadn't expected to be here today. He'd never expected his curiosity, his innocent love for planes, to spiral into something that felt like a crime. The officers had insisted on waiting for his parents to arrive. Jayden hadn't said much since the incident, all he could focus on was the pounding of his own heartbeat and the sound of his own breathing, which felt unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He could still see the image of Captain Stevens, the pilot who had called the police, standing there as if Jayden's very presence had been a threat. The way Stevens looked at him, it wasn't just about a boy in a restricted area. It felt personal, like there was something more to the situation than just a simple mistake. And that was what ate at Jayden the most. He didn't understand it. Why did Captain Stevens think he was a threat? Why did the airport security treat him like he was some kind of criminal? Jayden couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper happening here, a layer beneath the surface that no one had bothered to explain. It was as if, for some reason, Jayden was being held to a different standard than any other kid who wandered near the plains. His mind began to swirl with questions. Was it because he was black? Was it because of who his father was? The thought of his dad, Derek Williams, flashed in his mind, and a strange mixture of pride and guilt twisted inside him. Derek had worked his entire career to build a name for himself, to rise through the ranks of the aviation world. But now, Jayden wondered, would his dad's influence only make things worse? Would his father's position make him a target? As he stared out the small window of the office, he replayed the events of the past hour in his head. How everything had escalated so quickly. How he had just been standing there, gazing at the planes, when security had descended upon him. What had seemed like a harmless moment had turned into a nightmare. The anger inside Jayden grew. He wasn't the one who had done anything wrong, yet somehow, he was the one being punished. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Jayden fumbled to pull it out, and when he saw the message, his stomach tightened. It was from his mom, Monica. Monica, Jayden, where are you? The airport called and said something happened. I'm on my way. We will figure this out, okay? He quickly typed back, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure he could reassure himself. Jayden, Mom, I don't know what happened. They're keeping me here. It's not my fault. I just wanted to see the planes. The reply came instantly. Monica, stay calm, Jayden. I'm on my way right now. Don't talk to anyone until I get there. Jayden read her message again, his eyes stinging with frustration. He had always been a good kid. He didn't cause trouble, didn't break rules. But this felt like something more. And he couldn't help but feel like it was something he had no control over. Meanwhile, Derek Williams, the FAA administrator, was preparing for a meeting in Washington, D.C., when his phone buzzed. He had been in the middle of a tense conversation with an airline executive when the notification from his wife came through. The message was short but filled with a sense of urgency. Monica, Derek, Jayden's been detained at the airport. I don't know all the details, but the police are involved. His heart dropped. Derek had always prided himself on his ability to keep his family safe, to protect them from the world. But now, his son was in trouble, and Derek had no idea why. He quickly excused himself from the meeting, stepping into a corner of the room to make a call. His mind raced as he dialed Monica's number. The seconds felt like minutes as he waited for her to pick up. Monica, what's going on? Why was Jayden detained? What happened? Derek asked, his voice a mixture of concern and frustration. I don't know yet, Monica replied, her voice trembling. I'm on my way to the airport now. But Derek, they're treating him like he's a criminal. I don't understand it. I've never seen anything like this before. Derek's pulse quickened. What do you mean, treating him like a criminal? Was he arrested? No, not exactly. But they've called the police, and they're making him wait in an office. Derek, I'm scared. I'm scared for Jayden. Derek's mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. His son, his 12-year-old boy, was being treated like a threat. He didn't know if it was a case of misunderstanding or something more sinister. But either way, it wasn't right. I'm coming, Derek said firmly. Stay there. I'll be on the next flight. We'll get to the bottom of this. As he ended the call, Derek felt a surge of anger rise within him. This wasn't just about Jayden. This wasn't just about a mistake or an overreaction. This was something else. The way the officers had responded. The way Jayden had been treated like an outsider. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that his son had been targeted, and that realization made his blood boil. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It felt like a larger issue, a part of a bigger, darker problem that had been festering for a long time. Derek had worked hard his whole life to break barriers, to give his son the best life possible. But now, it seemed that no matter how hard they tried to rise above the noise, the world would always see them through a different lens. He had to get to the airport. And he had to do it fast. As Derek made his way to the airport, his mind was filled with a mix of emotions: fear for his son, anger at the unfair treatment, and a deep sense of helplessness. This was more than a father standing up for his child, this was about something much larger. It wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about his son being misunderstood. It was about how the system, no matter how hard they tried to navigate it, would always find a way to push back. And that realization hit Derek like a punch in the gut. The airport terminal was chaotic. Derek's flight had been delayed twice, but nothing could stop him from getting to Jayden. He could feel the tension building inside him, the fear for his son tightening like a vice around his chest. Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. He couldn't help but replay Monica's words in his mind: "They're treating him like he's a criminal." When he finally stepped off the plane, the overwhelming weight of the situation bore down on him. The normally familiar sight of the airport, with its bustling crowds and the endless sea of travelers, now felt foreign. Derek's mind wasn't on the people around him, it was fixed solely on his son. He made his way through the terminal, his pace quickening with each step. He texted Monica once again to make sure she was still at the airport, still with Jayden. The worry in her voice had been impossible to ignore, and the thought of her sitting there, waiting, while their son was being detained, fueled a new sense of urgency. When Derek arrived at the security office, the scene that unfolded before him was more than he had anticipated. Jayden sat alone, his face pale and withdrawn. He looked up briefly when Derek entered, but his eyes quickly fell again, as if the weight of everything had already crushed his spirit. "Jayden," Derek said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. He crossed the room, crouching down to his son's level. "Are you okay?" Jayden barely nodded, his eyes filled with confusion and a sense of helplessness that Derek hadn't seen before. It was a look he knew well from his own life, a look of frustration when you're caught in something bigger than yourself. Before Derek could say anything more, one of the security officers who had been standing nearby approached him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain calm." Derek turned to face the officer, his pulse rising. "Calm? My son is being detained. What happened here?" The officer's response was curt. "We received a report from Captain Stevens about a young boy in a restricted area. The situation escalated, and we had to call the police. We're still investigating." Derek felt a chill run down his spine. He had known something was off, but hearing the word escalated sent a jolt of anger through him. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. "What do you mean, escalated?" Jayden was just standing there, looking at the planes. He's never been in trouble in his life. The officer's gaze was unreadable, but the words that followed felt like a slap in the face. "It's not just about being in a restricted area. It's the way he was behaving. We were concerned." Derek's chest tightened. "Behaving? He's a kid. He wasn't causing any trouble. What exactly are you implying?" Before the officer could respond, a voice from the doorway cut through the tension. Monica had arrived, her face pale, but determined. She rushed to Jayden's side, pulling him into an embrace, her eyes wide with concern. "Jayden, are you okay?" "I'm here now." "It's going to be all right," Monica whispered, stroking his hair. Her voice trembled, but there was a softness there that calmed him, even in the middle of all this chaos. Derek turned to her, his own frustration rising. "Monica, what's going on? Why are they treating him like this? What happened?" "I don't know, Derek," Monica said, looking up at the officer with a mix of disbelief and anger. "They keep saying it's because of something Captain Stevens reported. But none of this makes any sense. Jayden didn't do anything wrong." The officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. We're still investigating, ma'am. It's just standard procedure. Derek took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool, but it was becoming harder to control his emotions. Standard procedure. My son is being treated like a criminal for nothing. We need answers now. Monica squeezed Jaden's hand, her gaze fixed on the officer, then on Derek. Derek, we need to figure out what's really going on here. Why would Captain Stevens report Jaden in the first place? He's just a kid. Derek turned back to the officer. You're telling me that this was all based on a report from one pilot? A report that caused all of this to happen? The officer hesitated, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. Sir, I'm just following protocol. The pilot made a report, and we had to take it seriously. We had no choice. Jaden's voice suddenly broke through the tension. Dad, I didn't do anything. I swear I didn't. Derek knelt down to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, Jaden. I know. You didn't do anything wrong. At that moment, a thought hit Derek like a lightning bolt. Captain Stevens had called the police. But why? The way the officer spoke, the way the situation had escalated so quickly, it wasn't just a case of a kid wandering too close to the planes. This was personal. Derek stood up, his jaw clenched tight. I'm calling the FAA, he said, his voice firm. If this is about anything other than a misunderstanding, we'll get to the bottom of it. Monica nodded in agreement, though her expression was still filled with doubt and concern. This doesn't make sense, Derek. Why would they treat him like this? Derek's hand hovered over his phone as he prepared to make the call. A knot of worry twisted in his stomach, but this time it wasn't just for his son, it was for the entire system. The very system that Derek had devoted his life to. The realization was hitting him harder than anything else in this moment. This wasn't just about his son. This was about something deeper, something darker lurking in the way society viewed people like them. As Derek prepared to make the call, Jaden looked up at him, his voice barely a whisper. Dad, is everything going to be okay? Derek's eyes softened as he looked into his son's eyes. The pain and confusion in Jaden's gaze cut through him like a knife. I'm going to make sure everything is okay, Jaden. No one is going to hurt you. We're going to figure this out. But as Derek stood there, his phone in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would forever change everything. What started as a simple misunderstanding in an airport had now become a battle that transcended just his son. Derek could feel the weight of it, the weight of not just protecting Jaden, but standing up against a world that often didn't see him as they saw everyone else. The tension in the room was unbearable. Derek's fingers hovered over his phone as he prepared to make the call to the FAA, but something held him back. The silence was deafening. Jaden was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, his eyes locked onto the floor, his body rigid with stress. Monica stood beside him, trying to comfort him, though it was clear that she, too, was on the edge. For the first time, Derek realized that this wasn't just about the incident. It wasn't just about the confusion or the tension between his son and the police. It was about something deeper. Something that, as much as he hated to admit it, he knew had been brewing beneath the surface for a long time. Derek had worked tirelessly to build a career, to rise through the ranks of the aviation world. He had done everything he could to give his family a better life, to make sure they didn't have to deal with the same prejudices and challenges that he had faced growing up. But now, standing in this cold airport security office, Derek couldn't help but feel like the world was reminding him of something he'd tried so hard to ignore. His son wasn't just being treated like a criminal because of a mistake. He wasn't being targeted because of his actions. It was deeper than that. It was about race. It was about the way people like Derek, like Jaden, were seen as threats, even when they were doing nothing wrong. It was about how, no matter how hard they tried to rise above, there would always be someone who saw them as less than. As the thought settled in, Derek's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen. It was a message from his assistant in Washington, D.C. "Assistant, Derek, we just received a report. Captain Stevens, he's filed an official complaint against Jayden. Claims that the boy was suspicious, that he was lurking too close to a restricted area. This isn't good. The press is already picking up on it." Derek's stomach dropped. His worst fears were coming to life. Monica read over his shoulder. "What is that? What does it mean?" Derek shook his head. "It means that this is bigger than just a misunderstanding. Captain Stevens didn't just make a report. He's actively trying to make this a bigger issue. This is about more than Jayden now. It's about how they're trying to make him out to be something he's not." The realization hit Derek like a freight train. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This wasn't a one-off misunderstanding between a young boy and a pilot. Captain Stevens had taken it upon himself to escalate things, to turn a simple mistake into something far more dangerous. And the consequences of that escalation were beginning to take shape. Derek ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This is about perception. It's about the image they want to create of a black kid, standing in an area he has no business being in. This is what they think of us. No matter how far we climb, we're still seen as threats, as out of place. Monica's face hardened as she stood tall, her voice steady despite the fear and anger she was clearly feeling. "But Derek, we can't let them get away with this. We can't let them do this to Jayden, or to anyone." Derek's heart swelled with pride for his wife, but the reality of the situation was beginning to weigh heavily on him. He had spent his whole career working to build a reputation, to prove that he belonged in the world of aviation. But now, in a matter of hours, everything he had worked for seemed irrelevant. It didn't matter that he was the FAA administrator. It didn't matter that he was respected in his field. When it came to his son, they still saw him as less than. Jayden, still sitting quietly in the corner, looked up at his parents. His eyes were filled with confusion, pain, and something deeper, a sense of betrayal. "Dad! Mom, why are they treating me like this? I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to look at the planes." The raw innocence in his voice hit Derek like a punch to the gut. His son, his 12-year-old boy, wasn't asking for anything more than a moment of peace, a glimpse into a world he loved. And yet, in an instant, that simple moment had turned into a nightmare. Derek knelt down beside Jayden, his heart breaking at the sight of his son's pain. "I know, son. I know," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't deserve any of this." Jayden's eyes welled up with tears, but he held them back. "Why do they think I'm a problem? I'm just a kid. Why are they treating me like I'm dangerous?" Derek's chest tightened, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. How could he explain this to his son? How could he make Jayden understand that this wasn't about him, that it wasn't his fault, and yet it was? The officer who had been standing at the door of the security office cleared his throat, drawing the family's attention. "Sir, we've been instructed to release your son. We'll be escorting you both out of the airport now." Derek stood up, his mind swirling. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to say to the officer, to Captain Stevens, to anyone who could explain how things had gotten so out of hand. But right now, the only thing that mattered was getting Jayden out of there. The officer led them toward the exit, but as they reached the doors of the airport, Derek felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. This wasn't just a fight to protect his son, it was a fight for dignity, for justice, for the right to exist in a world that often saw him and his family as threats instead of people. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Derek placed his arm around Jayden's shoulders, pulling him close. Monica walked beside them, her gaze fierce and determined. "We're going to fix this, Jayden," Derek said, his voice firm with conviction. "We won't let them get away with this. You didn't deserve any of this. And we're going to make sure no one else has to go through what you did." But deep down, Derek knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings. Derek had been thrust into a battle he had never expected, one that not only involved defending his son but also confronting a system that seemed intent on keeping people like him and Jayden at arm's length. Derek had always known that race played a role in how the world perceived him, but he had never truly grasped the extent of it until now. It wasn't just about the isolated moments of injustice that he and Monica had faced over the years, it was about the systemic biases that ran deep, like an invisible thread that wove its way through every part of their lives. And now, with Jayden at the center of it, Derek could no longer ignore the reality of it. He sat at his desk in his office, looking out the window at the Washington skyline. The weight of the FAA scandal loomed over him like a storm cloud, and he knew that this was bigger than just an issue between one pilot and his son. This was a battle for dignity, for respect, for their right to exist as equals in a world that often saw them as threats. Monica had been his rock throughout it all. She had handled the media inquiries with grace, speaking passionately about Jayden's innocence and the injustices they were facing. Derek was proud of her, but he knew that this wasn't just her fight, it was his, too. And it was a fight they couldn't lose. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had been avoiding. It was time to call in a favor, time to call in the power he held as the FAA administrator. If there was anyone who could help him take down Captain Stevens and expose the truth, it was the very people Derek had once worked alongside. After a few rings, the voice on the other end picked up. "Derek, good to hear from you," the voice said, sounding both friendly and distant. "What's going on?" "Brad, I need your help," Derek replied, his voice steady but carrying an urgency he couldn't hide. "It's about the situation with my son, Jayden. There's been a lot of misinformation and accusations flying around, and I need to make sure we get the truth out there." Brad paused for a moment, his voice lowering. "I'm sorry to hear about what happened. You know I've got your back, but I've seen the reports. It's already become a national story. The media's been quick to pick up on the race angle." Derek gritted his teeth. "I know, Brad. And that's exactly what I'm worried about. But this isn't about race, and it isn't about Jayden. It's about a man, Captain Stevens, who has a personal agenda and has made my son a target. We need to expose the truth before this spirals out of control." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Brad spoke again. "Okay, I'll see what I can do. But you're walking into a hornet's nest here, Derek. People are already choosing sides. You've got to be careful." Derek exhaled slowly. "I don't have the luxury of being careful anymore. I need this to end now. I need to make sure that no one else, no other family, has to go through what we've gone through." Brad sighed. "Understood. I'll make a few calls and get back to you. Hang in there." As Derek hung up the phone, he felt a mix of relief and fear. He had taken the first step toward clearing his son's name, but he knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The system was powerful, and the people involved, especially someone like Captain Stevens, wouldn't give up without a fight. The next morning, the media storm had escalated. News outlets across the country were covering the story, with some framing it as an unfortunate misunderstanding, while others pointed to the racial undertones of the incident. Derek's face appeared on screens everywhere, but not as the FAA administrator he had once been proud to represent. No, now he was a father fighting for his son in a world that seemed determined to tear them down. The story was everywhere, and the public's reaction was mixed. Some supported Jayden, understanding that he was simply a curious child caught up in a situation far beyond his control. Others questioned the family's story, accusing them of playing the race card. It was an exhausting cycle of misinformation, assumptions, and speculation, and Derek was becoming more and more frustrated with each passing day. But it was Jayden who surprised Derek the most. Monica and Derek had been preparing for a public statement when Jayden asked to speak. Derek was hesitant at first, not wanting his son to carry that burden, but Jayden was insistent. "I want to say something," Jayden said, his voice quiet but determined. "People need to know the truth." Monica looked at Derek, searching his eyes for reassurance. Derek knew this wasn't going to be easy, but Jayden's conviction was unshakable. With a deep breath, Derek nodded. "All right, son. Let's do it." The family sat down together, facing the cameras, and Jayden took the microphone in his small hands. He looked directly into the lens, his voice steady as he spoke. "Hi, I'm Jayden. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just looking at the planes. I love planes. And I know that people are saying things about me that aren't true. But I just want everyone to know that I'm not a bad person. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just want to be like everyone else." His words, simple yet powerful, struck a chord with people across the country. The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability of a child caught in a storm he didn't understand, captured the hearts of many. Derek watched as Jayden spoke, his own eyes welling up with pride. This wasn't just a moment for Jayden, it was a turning point for their family. It was the moment they would no longer be silent. The days that followed were filled with progress, though slow and hard-won. Brad's calls to key figures within the FAA had begun to yield results. Captain Stevens was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Derek's name, though still tainted by the media's portrayal, was starting to shift toward the narrative of a father fighting for his son, rather than just a high-ranking official. But more importantly, the family began to feel a glimmer of hope. Derek and Monica realized that, even in the face of such adversity, there was power in their voices. They weren't just victims in this story, they were catalysts for change. They had the ability to make sure that no one else had to experience what Jayden had gone through. As they sat around the dinner table that evening, the weight of everything still hanging in the air, Derek finally let out a long breath. "We've made it through the worst of it," he said, his voice heavy with both relief and reflection. "But there's still work to be done. For Jayden. For us. For everyone." Monica smiled softly, placing her hand over his. "And we'll do it together." Jayden looked up from his plate, his face brightening. "We're not going to let them stop us, right?" Derek chuckled, pulling his son into a hug. "No. We're not. Not now, not ever." The days following Jayden's public statement were a whirlwind of emotions. The media, which had initially torn into the family with a relentless barrage of opinions, had now shifted focus. Many people rallied behind Jayden's honesty, while others started questioning their own assumptions about the incident. Derek had been inundated with interviews and phone calls, some supportive, others far less so. But he couldn't focus on the noise, the only thing that mattered now was his family and the truth. The investigation into Captain Stevens was underway, and although it was clear that the FAA would eventually take action, the process was slow and bureaucratic. Derek hated it. He wanted swift justice for Jayden, wanted to expose the wrongs done against him as quickly as possible, but he knew that sometimes the wheels of institutional change moved at a glacial pace. Meanwhile, the world continued to watch. The media outlets that had once cast aspersions on the family now struggled to remain neutral as the public opinion began to shift. People who had previously dismissed the idea of racial profiling started to speak out, sharing their own stories of discrimination and prejudice. The hashtag Justice for Jayden trended for days, sparking conversations that had long been pushed to the margins of public discourse. But for Derek and Monica, the attention was both a blessing and a curse. It brought awareness, yes, but it also brought pressure. It was one thing to fight for justice when you were an unknown individual, it was another entirely when your every move was scrutinized by the world. One evening, Derek sat alone in his office at home, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His desk was littered with papers, press clippings, and emails. The air around him felt thick with exhaustion. He hadn't realized how much he had been carrying until this moment. Monica knocked softly before entering, her smile a mixture of concern and love. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of warmth. Derek didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. "I'm tired, Mon. I know this is important, what we're doing. But, sometimes it feels like we're just swimming against the current." Monica walked over and sat down beside him. "You're not alone in this. We're in this together, all of us." He turned to look at her, her face soft and understanding. "I'm afraid," he confessed. "Afraid that no matter how hard we try, things won't change. That Jaden will have to keep fighting this battle for the rest of his life. I'm afraid of failing him." Monica took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "You're not failing him, Derek. You're showing him what it means to stand up for what's right. And that's what matters." Derek closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just fighting for his son anymore, he was fighting for every family like his, every person who had ever felt less than or been dismissed by a system that didn't see them as equal. As he sat in that quiet moment with Monica, Derek realized something else: the fight was bigger than any one person. It wasn't just about Jaden's future. It was about creating a world where people didn't have to face the same struggles, the same injustice. It was about making sure that the next generation of kids, whether they were Black, Hispanic, Asian, or any other background, didn't have to bear the same burdens. The following day, Derek received an unexpected call. It was from Brad, the FAA colleague who had been working behind the scenes to get the investigation moving. Derek could sense the urgency in Brad's voice as soon as he picked up. "Derek, I've got news," Brad said, his tone serious. "Captain Stevens has been placed on indefinite suspension, pending further review. We've also uncovered some discrepancies in his report. He lied about some key details. The investigation is far from over, but this is a big step forward." Derek exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. "So, he's finally being held accountable." Brad paused for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not perfect, Derek. It's not the immediate justice we both wanted. But it's a start. And it's a clear message that the FAA won't tolerate this kind of behavior. We're taking this seriously." Derek's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and frustration. He had wanted more, wanted to see Stevens publicly exposed, to see justice served in a way that would send a clear message. But he knew this was a beginning. A small victory, but one that could lead to larger change. "Thank you, Brad. I appreciate everything you've done. I'll keep pushing. We all will." The next few weeks were filled with difficult but necessary conversations. Derek spoke to his superiors at the FAA about pushing for more comprehensive anti-racial profiling training for all airline and airport staff. He reached out to other families who had been affected by discrimination, offering support and a platform to share their stories. Monica continued to be the voice of reason, her calm and unwavering presence helping to ground Derek when the pressure became too much. Jaden, though still a bit shaken by the events, had begun to process what had happened. Derek and Monica made sure to spend more time with him, taking him out of the public eye for a while and allowing him to just be a kid again. They went to the park, played board games, and talked about what he loved most, airplanes, of course. Derek encouraged him to dream big, to pursue whatever passions he had without fear of what others might say. But even as Jaden's smile began to return, Derek knew that their journey wasn't over. It wasn't just about clearing his son's name, it was about creating a legacy of change. It was about rewriting the narrative for Black families, for families who had long been forced to navigate a world that saw them as less than, no matter how much they succeeded or fought to belong. One evening, as Derek and Monica sat together, watching Jaden play in the backyard, Derek felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about one bad pilot or one bad incident. It was about a system that needed to be reshaped from the ground up. "We can do this," Derek said, his voice firm. "We have to." Monica nodded, her hand resting on his. "And we will, together." Derek and Monica had come a long way since the chaos first erupted. What began as a singular, deeply personal struggle for justice had now grown into a movement. The truth behind Jayden's arrest, an incident driven by bias and prejudice, was slowly starting to resonate across the country. The family was no longer simply fighting for the truth, they were fighting for a future where children of all races could feel safe and seen in a world that often viewed them with suspicion. Yet even with all the media attention, the powerful allies they had gained, and the internal investigations underway, the weight of their journey was still ever present. The feeling of constant scrutiny, the fear that the story would somehow be twisted or forgotten, those pressures never went away. It had become the new normal, but it was wearing Derek thin. Still, as tiring as the process was, the family found a sense of purpose in the work they were doing. Derek's position at the FAA had given him access to powerful networks, but it also gave him the responsibility of using his voice and influence for real change. This was about more than just ensuring that Captain Stevens would never be allowed near an airport again. It was about reshaping an entire industry that had allowed such prejudices to flourish. The momentum of the case had grown so much that Derek found himself in meetings with lawmakers, media figures, and other influential figures in aviation. They were discussing policies that could address systemic racism in the aviation industry, including better racial sensitivity training for airline staff, more diverse recruitment in aviation schools, and a commitment from all major airlines to track racial profiling complaints in a way that was transparent and actionable. But it wasn't just about policy changes. Derek knew that to make any real impact, the conversation had to shift. Public attitudes about race had to evolve, people had to acknowledge the biases they carried, whether conscious or unconscious. This was the hard part. On one particularly grueling day, Derek sat at his desk, staring at a report filled with statistics about racial profiling in the aviation industry. Despite the overwhelming evidence, there were still many who would defend the status quo, claiming that the issues weren't as widespread as they appeared. Derek had heard it all before, people who insisted that what had happened to Jayden was an isolated incident, that the problem was just a few bad apples. It was that mindset that had kept the industry stagnated for so long. But he was determined to break it. Later that week, as Derek prepared for a press conference about the progress of the FAA investigation, Jayden's school called. It was a principal from the school, and Derek's heart sank, expecting the worst. But instead, the voice on the other end was calm. "Mr. Foster, I wanted to let you know that Jayden has been incredibly brave during all of this. We've received a lot of support for him, and we're going to make sure he has a platform to share his story. We're organizing a small event at school, a chance for Jayden and other students who want to speak out to do so. Would you be open to this?" Derek felt a lump form in his throat. His son, his young son, was becoming an advocate, an example of resilience. He had known Jayden was strong, but this was something different. "I'm proud of him," Derek said quietly. "Please let me know the details, and we'll make sure we're there." The event turned out to be an empowering experience for Jayden. Standing up in front of his classmates, he shared his story, what had happened, how it had made him feel, and how he wanted to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. The school applauded him for his bravery, but it was the support from his peers, both black and white, that made it truly transformative. The event marked a significant milestone for Jayden, one where he no longer viewed himself as a victim, but as an agent of change. It also marked a shift for Derek. He wasn't just fighting for his son anymore, he was fighting for every child, for every parent, for every family that had ever been made to feel less than. That night, as Derek and Monica sat down for dinner, the conversation shifted from the ongoing battle to a much-needed moment of reflection. "You know, Mon," Derek began, his voice thoughtful, "I didn't realize how much of an impact this whole thing would have on Jayden. At first, I was just worried about clearing his name. But now, seeing him up there, talking about this, I can't help but feel proud. Not just as his father, but as someone who knows this fight is about something bigger than us." Monica smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "I think he's always had it in him. He's always been our little fighter. And now he's showing the world what he's made of." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey heavy in the air. It was then that Derek realized just how much this experience had shaped him, not just as a father or a leader, but as a person. He had always fought for justice, but now, he was fighting for something he couldn't control: change. The next step was clear, and Derek knew there was no turning back now. His family had stepped into the spotlight, and they were determined to use that light to push for change. It was no longer just about this moment, it was about ensuring that the future would be better for Jaden, for his classmates, for everyone. In the days that followed, Derek took a step back from his usual press conference duties. He spent more time with Jaden, watching him slowly recover from the stress of the media frenzy. He watched Monica's strength as she balanced the public's demand for answers with her unshakable belief in their mission. But it was Jaden who continually inspired him. Every time he saw his son's face, whether laughing at a silly movie, excitedly talking about his next airplane model, or even just asking for help with homework, Derek was reminded of the reason they were fighting. This wasn't just about proving a point to the world. It was about creating a world where children like Jaden didn't have to fight at all. A world where fairness, empathy, and equality were not just ideals, but everyday realities. And with that realization, Derek found himself more determined than ever to keep pushing forward, no matter the challenges ahead. The public's response to the incident with Jaden had been both overwhelming and inspiring. Across the nation, social media platforms were buzzing with support, and for the first time in a long while, Derek felt like the conversation was shifting in a direction that could lead to real change. He could see it in the faces of the people he spoke with daily, fellow FAA employees, legislators, and even strangers who had reached out to him personally. There was an undeniable energy, an urgency, that hadn't been there before. But Derek knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. He could already feel the forces aligning against them, forces who wanted to push the conversation back to where it had been before Jaden's story broke. People who were comfortable with the way things had always been. And now, as the stakes grew higher, Derek realized there was a hidden threat lurking in the shadows, those who wanted to sabotage the progress that had been made. One afternoon, after a long meeting with lawmakers about the new racial profiling policies, Derek returned home to find Monica sitting in the living room, her expression tight and her eyes focused on her phone. "Mon?" Derek asked, his voice low. "What's going on?" Monica looked up, her face grim. "There's a story online, someone's trying to discredit Jaden. They're saying he exaggerated the whole thing, that the pilot was just doing his job, and that Jaden and you are using this to push an agenda. It's all over some of the forums, and it's spreading fast." Derek felt a surge of anger rise within him. It wasn't surprising, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known this kind of backlash would come, but seeing it play out so publicly made it feel all the more personal. "What are they saying exactly?" Derek asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Monica shook her head. "They're claiming that Jaden was acting aggressively, that he was being disruptive and didn't follow the pilot's instructions. They're even pulling up old photos of you and suggesting that your position at the FAA is why the story is getting so much attention." Derek's jaw clenched, but he didn't want to give in to the fury bubbling inside him. "We can't let this distract us. We have the truth on our side." Monica nodded, but her concern didn't fade. "I know, but this is the kind of thing that can derail everything. People are going to start questioning our motives, and if they don't see us as genuine, all the progress we've made could be undone." Derek knew she was right. The public was fickle, and stories like this had a way of snowballing. If they weren't careful, the narrative could shift away from justice and turn into an attack on their integrity. The next few days were a blur of counterattacks. Derek's team worked tirelessly to gather evidence that could prove Jaden's version of events was the truth. They dug through security footage, interviewed eyewitnesses who had been on the plane with Jaden, and contacted industry experts who could attest to the behavior of pilots and their duties. But despite their best efforts, the backlash continued to grow. News outlets began picking up on the conspiracy theories, and soon, stories began to crop up questioning the authenticity of the investigation itself. Derek found himself facing a hard truth: the fight wasn't just about clearing Jayden's name anymore. It was about protecting the truth from being distorted by a wave of misinformation. And that was far harder than he had imagined. One evening, as Derek sat in his office trying to make sense of the growing storm, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Brad from the FAA, Derek's most trusted colleague. He stepped inside, his face etched with concern. "Derek, we need to talk," Brad said, his voice low. "What's going on?" Derek asked, his heart skipping a beat. Brad sat down across from him, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "There's something you need to know. There are whispers inside the FAA. Some of the higher-ups are getting cold feet about this whole thing. They don't want the FAA to become the face of racial justice. It's too controversial, too politically charged. Some of them are even suggesting we distance ourselves from this case." Derek's stomach tightened. He had feared this moment would come, but hearing it from Brad made it all the more real. "You're telling me they're going to back out?" Brad nodded. "It's not certain yet, but there are talks. They're worried about the fallout, about what this could mean for their careers if they continue to back you up publicly." Derek stood up, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "This isn't about politics. This is about doing the right thing. This is about justice for my son." "I know," Brad said quietly. "But you know how the game is played. Once you're this deep in, the stakes change. And right now, there are people who are more concerned about their positions than they are about what happened to Jayden." The room seemed to close in on Derek. He had never felt so alone in this battle. The people who were supposed to be his allies were turning away. "We can't let them get away with this," Derek said, his voice filled with determination. "This isn't just about the FAA or me. This is about making sure this never happens again. We're going to keep fighting, Brad. We're not backing down." Brad hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll do what I can to help. But you need to be prepared. The pushback is only going to get worse." The next few weeks were filled with tension. Derek and his team continued to gather evidence to prove that Jayden's story was true, but the counter-narrative was growing louder. The FAA, despite the support from some allies, was under pressure from its own ranks to distance itself from the case. Derek found himself at a crossroads. He could either fight for the truth at great personal cost, or he could step back and let the forces of status quo win. But there was no choice for Derek. He had already made the commitment to his family, to Jayden, and to the thousands of others who had reached out to show their support. The fight had become bigger than just one incident. It was a fight for every person who had ever been unfairly treated or overlooked. And he would be damned if he let it end here. The battle was growing fiercer, but so too was Derek's resolve. As the days wore on, the media storm intensified, and with it, the deepening divide inside the FAA. Derek had once believed that truth, integrity, and justice would ultimately guide the industry toward meaningful change. But now, with the pressure mounting from all sides, he was beginning to realize how many people were willing to sacrifice those principles for personal gain. Inside the FAA, it wasn't just the silent whispers from the higher-ups that concerned Derek. There was something far more insidious happening behind closed doors. He had always trusted his colleagues, but now the cracks were beginning to show. More and more, Derek was beginning to notice a subtle shift in how he was treated. Meetings that had once been filled with camaraderie and mutual respect were now fraught with tension and avoidance. Brad, his closest confidant, had warned him about the cold feet growing within the ranks. But what Brad hadn't mentioned were the quiet betrayals happening all around him. Derek hadn't yet fully grasped just how much was at stake for those with the power to make decisions, the ones who stood to lose the most if the FAA was forced to confront its own failings. One evening, as Derek sat at his desk, reviewing the latest set of documents related to Jayden's case, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous number. Watch your back. Not everyone has your best interests at heart. Trust no one. His heart sank. At first, Derek thought it was just a scare tactic, some sort of ill-intentioned message meant to unsettle him. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that someone close to him, was trying to undermine his efforts. The next day, Derek had a meeting scheduled with one of the top FAA executives, Sheila Weston. Sheila had always been a steady ally in the past, someone Derek could count on for support. But as they sat across from each other in a quiet conference room, Derek couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled in his gut. So, Derek, Sheila began, her voice measured but strained, I've been thinking about the situation, and I believe it's time we reassess the direction this case is taking. Derek's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Sheila hesitated for a moment before continuing. There's a lot of pressure from upper management to, distance ourselves from the public stance we've taken on Jayden's situation. They feel it's becoming too divisive, too controversial. And frankly, it's starting to hurt the FAA's image. The last thing we need is for this to escalate further, especially with the upcoming elections. Derek's fists clenched under the table. He could hear the faint echo of Brad's warning in his mind, the stakes change when you're this deep in. Sheila wasn't just concerned for the agency's reputation, she was concerned for her own position. Derek could see the fear in her eyes. Fear that if this case went any further, it would cost her more than she was willing to pay. I thought you were on the side of justice, Derek said, his voice low but firm. You know what happened wasn't just an isolated incident. This is about a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. We can't just back down now. Sheila's expression faltered, but she quickly recovered. I understand that, Derek. I really do. But you have to think about the bigger picture here. We can't afford to be seen as the agency leading the charge for social justice. There are too many people who think this is about something else, something more personal. You've already made enemies with this, and if we keep pushing, it could get worse. The words hit Derek like a slap in the face. Sheila wasn't just offering a different perspective, she was giving him an ultimatum. If he continued to pursue the truth, he risked everything, the FAA, his career, and his reputation. But if he backed down, the firestorm would die down, and everything would go back to normal. At least for her. I can't back down, Derek said, his voice resolute. Not after everything we've been through. Not after what happened to Jayden. Sheila's eyes softened for just a moment, but the hardened resolve in her voice remained. I'm sorry, Derek. But I think you already know that there are powers at play here that are far bigger than us. And if you keep pushing forward, you might find yourself without any allies. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, suffocating the space between them. Derek stood up, refusing to let her see how shaken he was. I'll make my own way. And I'll find the allies who are willing to stand for what's right. As Derek walked out of the room, he couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. Sheila wasn't just suggesting they back down, she was actively trying to ensure that he did. Later that night, Derek sat with Monica in their living room, recounting the conversation with Sheila. Monica listened intently, her face a mask of concern, but also determination. It's starting to look like this fight is bigger than we thought, Derek said, rubbing his temples. The people we thought were on our side, some of them aren't. Sheila's backing out, and I can't help but think she's not the only one. Monica reached across the table and took Derek's hand in hers. You knew this wouldn't be easy. But we can't let their fear dictate our actions. You've come this far. Jayden's come this far. We've all come this far. We can't back down now. Derek looked at his wife, her eyes steady and filled with the same resolve that had carried them through so much already. "You're right," he said softly. "We're in this together. No matter what happens." In the days that followed, Derek began to take a more direct approach. He started reaching out to allies outside the FAA, activists, civil rights groups, and even people who had worked in aviation policy reform for years. He needed to ensure that the movement wasn't just tied to the FAA, and that it couldn't be undermined by a few people trying to protect their own interests. He wasn't just fighting for Jaden anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever felt the sting of injustice, and for every child who deserved to grow up in a world where they were seen for who they truly were, not who others assumed they were based on the color of their skin. But even as Derek strengthened his alliances, the threat loomed larger than ever. Sheila wasn't the only one who would betray him. And as he dug deeper, Derek realized that the forces working against him were far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Derek sat at his desk, staring at the stack of files in front of him. Every piece of evidence, every report, every legal brief, it all pointed to one undeniable truth: Jaden had been wronged. The more Derek delved into the case, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a simple incident between a boy and a pilot, it was part of a much larger, systemic issue that had been buried for too long. But now, as the storm raged on, the personal stakes were growing. Derek could feel the pressure mounting, not just from the public, but from his own colleagues at the FAA. He couldn't shake the sense that there was something much more insidious at play behind the scenes, an invisible hand pulling the strings, manipulating the narrative, and trying to push the issue into the shadows. The betrayal from Sheila was only the tip of the iceberg. She wasn't the only one trying to sabotage his efforts. The deeper Derek looked, the more he started to connect the dots between the powerful individuals who were quietly pulling the strings. Some were FAA executives, others were powerful lobbyists, and even some political figures were starting to make their moves, all with one common goal: to protect the status quo and prevent real change. That night, as Derek sat alone in his office after hours, a message pinged on his computer. It was a tip from an anonymous source, someone within the FAA who wanted to remain unidentified. The message was short, but the implications were clear. "They're planning something. You're being watched. Trust no one." Derek sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He had suspected that someone within the FAA had been leaking information, but now he knew for certain. The fight wasn't just about truth and justice anymore. It was about survival. The next morning, Derek met with Brad, his most trusted ally within the FAA, at a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Brad had been the one person who hadn't wavered in his support, and Derek knew that he could rely on him now more than ever. "Brad, I think we've reached a tipping point," Derek said, keeping his voice low as he leaned in closer. "It's not just Sheila. There's something bigger happening here. People with real power are trying to take this story down, and they're willing to do anything to bury it." Brad nodded, his face tense. "I've been hearing the same things. There are whispers, executives, lobbyists, even some high-ranking officials in the government. They don't want this to go public. They don't want the FAA to be the center of a racial justice conversation. And the more you push, the more they're going to try to shut you down." "I know," Derek replied, his jaw tightening. "But I won't back down. Not now, not after everything we've been through. We've got to keep pushing forward, but we need to be smarter about it. There are too many people with too much to lose. We need to figure out who's really behind this, and expose them." Brad glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "There's someone I think can help. I don't trust anyone else, but I trust him. He's been working on corruption cases within the FAA for years. He's got the kind of dirt on these people that could bring them all down. His name is Greg Turner." Derek's brow furrowed. Greg Turner. I've heard of him. But he's always been in the background. Why would he be interested in helping us? Because, Derek, Brad said quietly, he's seen the same things we have. And he's been trying to bring them down for years. He's got the connections, the resources, and the inside knowledge we need. But we'll have to be careful. He's a shadowy figure, and he's got a reputation for playing things close to the chest. Derek nodded. He had no choice but to trust Brad's judgment. If they were going to get to the bottom of this, they needed all the help they could get. Later that evening, Derek arranged a discreet meeting with Greg Turner at a nondescript diner on the edge of town. As he entered, he spotted Greg immediately. He was sitting in a corner booth, his face obscured by the brim of a worn baseball cap, his posture relaxed but alert. Greg, Derek greeted him, sliding into the booth across from him. Thanks for meeting with me. Greg didn't say anything at first, just studied Derek with cold, calculating eyes. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. You've been digging, Derek. You've been asking questions you shouldn't be asking. I'm trying to get to the truth, Derek said, his voice firm. I've seen the signs. I know something's off with this case. The FAA's trying to bury it, but I can't let that happen. You're the only one I can turn to for help. Greg's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. You don't know who you're dealing with. These people aren't just powerful, they're ruthless. If you push too hard, they'll come after you. They'll come after your family. I've seen it before. I'm not backing down, Derek said, his voice unwavering. Jayden deserves justice. And I won't let them silence us. Greg studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll help you. But you have to understand something, this is going to get ugly. We're not just taking on the FAA anymore. We're taking on some of the most powerful people in the country. And they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who stands in their way. Derek nodded, feeling the weight of Greg's words settle over him. I understand. But we have to do this. For Jayden. For everyone who's been wronged. Greg looked around the diner cautiously before speaking again. I've got the files. The ones that prove everything. You want to expose the puppeteers behind the scenes. I'll make sure you have what you need. But once you have these, there's no turning back. Derek's heart raced. He had finally found a way forward, but now the real battle was about to begin. He was about to unmask the hidden forces that had been pulling the strings, and he knew that once he did, there would be no going back. As Derek walked out of the diner, the weight of what he had just agreed to began to sink in. The fight ahead would be the hardest of his life, but it was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. He had come too far, and there was too much at stake. For Jayden. For Monica. For the future. And as the sun set behind him, Derek felt a surge of determination rise within him. The truth would come to light. No matter the cost. Derek sat at his kitchen table, the files Greg Turner had given him spread out in front of him. It was late, far later than he had intended to stay up, but he couldn't tear himself away. The documents were filled with names, dates, and shady connections that spanned far beyond what he had imagined. It was more than just the FAA's internal corruption, this was bigger, more sinister. It was a network of influence that extended into government, corporate partnerships, and even some prominent media figures. The scale of it was staggering. Derek's eyes skimmed over the papers as he tried to make sense of the web in front of him. Every name seemed to be connected to someone more powerful, more influential. As he flipped through the pages, he stumbled upon a few familiar names, people he had crossed paths with in his time at the FAA. They weren't just low-level employees or even middle management, these were high-ranking officials. Powerful figures who had the means to suppress information and control narratives. It wasn't just about making sure Jayden's case was forgotten, it was about maintaining power at all costs. But then something caught his eye, an email thread between several FAA executives, one of whom was none other than Sheila Weston. The emails detailed a covert meeting between the FAA and a few government officials. The topic of discussion: discrediting Jayden's case and making sure the incident was dismissed as a one-off misunderstanding. What shocked Derek even more was that they had planned to paint Jayden as a troublemaker, someone who was creating unnecessary controversy in the media, in order to protect the image of the industry. This was what Sheila had been trying to do when she'd urged him to back down. She wasn't just concerned about the FAA's reputation. She was actively involved in a cover-up. Derek's hands trembled as he sifted through the pages, but he knew he had found something crucial. This wasn't just corruption at the top, it was an entire system built on lies, designed to protect the rich and powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Jayden was just a pawn in a much larger game. But this wasn't just about taking down the FAA or exposing Sheila, it was about exposing the forces that had kept these corrupt systems in place for far too long. Derek took a deep breath. He knew he needed to act, and act fast. The information in front of him could blow the case wide open, but if he wasn't careful, it could also destroy him and everyone he cared about. The following day, Derek reached out to Brad again, knowing that he couldn't navigate this alone. Brad had always been the voice of reason, and now, more than ever, Derek needed that steady presence. They met at their usual cafe, the one far enough from their workplace to avoid suspicion, but close enough for convenience. "I've got the smoking gun," Derek said, sliding the file across the table. Greg came through. "These documents, they'll expose everything, the FAA's plan to discredit Jayden, the media manipulation, the collusion with government officials. It's all here." Brad glanced around before quickly opening the file, scanning the contents. His face grew pale as he read through the papers, but his eyes locked onto Derek's. This is huge, Derek. You're not kidding when you say this goes deep. You're talking about the highest levels of power." Derek nodded. "It's worse than I thought. Sheila was involved in trying to cover this up, and now she's got even more people in her corner. But we can't let them get away with it. The public needs to see this. They need to know how much is at stake." Brad closed the file, his face etched with concern. "You're right. But we need to be careful. If we go public with this, we're putting a target on our backs. These people won't just stop at discrediting us, they'll do everything they can to destroy us." "I know," Derek said, his voice firm. "But we don't have a choice anymore. This isn't just about me or Jayden, it's about everyone who's been affected by this system. If we don't stand up now, nothing will ever change." Brad let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. "All right, I'm in. But we need to make sure we have a plan. We can't just throw this out there without covering all our bases. The media, the public, if we want to make sure the truth gets out, we need to be strategic." Derek nodded. "We'll go public, but we'll do it in stages. First, we'll leak some of the smaller details, enough to get people talking, enough to create a buzz. Then, when the pressure's on, we'll drop the big bomb, the collusion, the cover-up. We'll make sure no one can ignore it." Brad looked at Derek for a long moment before finally nodding. "I trust you, man. But you better be ready for the storm that's coming." As Derek and Brad planned their next moves, a sense of urgency began to settle in. The longer they waited, the more likely it was that those responsible for the corruption would cover their tracks or silence them. Derek knew they needed to act quickly, and carefully. The next few days were a blur of activity. Derek worked tirelessly to organize the evidence, deciding which pieces of the puzzle to release first. He knew that even a single misstep could ruin everything. But with every hour that passed, the weight of the truth grew heavier on his shoulders. That night, Derek sat alone at his desk, preparing a message to send to a few trusted journalists. He needed to be sure they understood the gravity of what he was about to reveal. This was no longer just a case about racial injustice on an airplane, this was about systemic corruption at the highest levels of government and industry. As he typed out the message, Derek's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Monica. He picked up immediately, eager to hear her voice after so many late nights. "Hey, love," Monica's voice came through the phone, soft and warm. "How's everything going?" Derek smiled, grateful for the distraction. "It's going. It's all coming together. But I need to be careful. If I mess this up, everything we've worked for could be lost." "I know," Monica said, her voice steady. "But you've got this. I believe in you. We all do." Her words gave him the strength he needed to push forward. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for the future. For Jayden. For his family. For the people who had been silenced for far too long. As Derek sent the message to the journalists, a sense of resolve settled over him. The truth was about to come to light. And nothing, no one, could stop him now. Derek's heart pounded as he stared at the screen of his laptop, watching the first leak hit the media. The journalists he had reached out to were quick to pick up the story, and it was already making waves. The headline read: FAA execs involved in cover-up of racially charged incident, whistleblower comes forward. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was enough to stir the pot. The phone calls and messages started coming in immediately, interviews, demands for statements, and questions from reporters all over the country. The pressure was mounting, and Derek knew this was only the beginning. The storm had started, and there was no turning back. At first, the reaction from the public was mixed. Some people were outraged, demanding further investigation into the claims. Others were skeptical, questioning whether there was a hidden agenda behind the leak. But as more stories came to light, stories about Sheila Weston's involvement in orchestrating the cover-up, and the evidence pointing to systematic racism within the FAA, the public outcry grew louder. Derek leaned back in his chair, taking in the whirlwind of activity. He knew they had to strike while the iron was hot. The timing was critical. They couldn't let the narrative die down, not when they were so close to exposing the truth. He had already begun gathering the next round of explosive information, the emails detailing the FAA's internal efforts to manipulate the media, the phone records showing how high-ranking officials had communicated with government operatives to block the investigation, and the financial documents showing the extent of the FAA's political donations, all aimed at protecting their interests. It was a full-scale operation to maintain control over the narrative, and it was only a matter of time before it would all unravel. But with every passing minute, Derek couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The power behind this cover-up was vast, and they would do anything to make sure it stayed hidden. There were forces working against him now, people who didn't want the truth to come out. The phone calls were becoming more threatening, the messages more ominous. He couldn't help but wonder just how far they would go to silence him. The following day, Derek met with Brad again. They were both feeling the heat from the media storm, but there was something else in the air, something darker. The tension between them was palpable, and Derek could see it in Brad's eyes. "We're playing with fire now," Brad said, glancing around the cafe nervously. "The press is all over it, but so are they. The people we're up against, they've got more resources, more power than we could ever imagine." Derek looked at Brad, his jaw clenched. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. But we've come this far. We can't back down now." Brad sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I get that, but we've got to be smart. These people play dirty. They'll try to tear us down any way they can. We've got to stay one step ahead of them." Derek nodded. He was well aware of how dangerous this was becoming. "I've been thinking about that. We need to bring in someone else. Someone with the power to take this all the way to the top." Brad raised an eyebrow. "Who do you have in mind?" Derek hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We need Greg Turner. He's got the connections, the influence, and the knowledge of how to handle something like this. If we want to take down the entire network, we need him on our side. Brad looked skeptical. You trust him? He's been in the shadows for years, Derek. Are you sure he's the right person for this? I don't have a choice, Derek said, his voice steady. We need all the help we can get. And Greg's the one person who's been fighting the same battle for years. If he's willing to help us, it could be the turning point we need. Brad looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. Let's reach out to him. But we've got to be careful. If we go too hard, we could end up making ourselves the target. Meanwhile, the pressure from the media was intensifying. Derek's phone rang off the hook with requests for interviews, comments, and exclusive statements. He couldn't keep up with it all, and soon he realized he needed to prioritize. If he was going to stay focused on the fight, he couldn't get distracted by the noise. But even as the story gained momentum, Derek started to notice something strange. The more attention the story received, the more it seemed like some of the information was being deliberately twisted. The narrative was shifting from a story of corruption within the FAA to a narrative of sensationalism and media bias. Some outlets, even those he had initially trusted, began to focus on the controversy surrounding the leak itself, questioning the credibility of the whistleblower and casting doubt on the validity of the documents. Derek knew they needed to stay ahead of this. If they allowed the narrative to shift, they would lose control of the story. That was when he realized something he had missed earlier: there was someone within the media trying to steer the conversation in a different direction. Someone powerful enough to influence the coverage, and someone who likely had ties to the FAA. As Derek reached out to Greg Turner, his anxiety grew. They needed to act fast, and every minute that passed made the situation more volatile. If they didn't expose the truth before the narrative completely changed, they could lose their only chance at taking down the entire system. Greg's response came quickly: he agreed to meet. They arranged a time and place for their meeting, a location that would ensure privacy, an old conference room in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where they could speak freely, away from prying eyes. The meeting was tense. Derek could feel the weight of what was on the line. The very future of his investigation depended on Greg's involvement. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with anticipation as Greg sat across from him, eyes narrowed and hands folded. I've seen the leaks, Greg said, his voice low. And I've seen the media response. It's exactly what I expected. They're trying to discredit the story before it goes any further. Derek nodded. Exactly. And that's why we need to take the next step. We've got the proof, Greg. The whole system is rigged. We've got Sheila, we've got the executives, and we've got the government connections. It's all here. Greg leaned forward, his gaze sharp. I'm in. But we're going to need to be strategic about this. If we go full throttle now, they'll bury us. We need to expose them in layers, make sure the public sees every angle, every connection. Then, when it's all out in the open, we hit them with the full truth. Derek felt a surge of relief. Greg's words were exactly what he needed to hear. They were about to go on the offensive, and with Greg's expertise, they had a real chance at bringing down the system. As they prepared to make their next move, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something monumental. The storm was only getting started, and soon, the truth would come crashing through the doors. The question was, who would survive the aftermath? The following weeks were a whirlwind. The media coverage surrounding the FAA scandal grew exponentially as more and more leaked information found its way into the public eye. Derek and Brad, alongside Greg, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, carefully orchestrating each piece of the puzzle, making sure the revelations came at a pace that would build momentum but not tip them off too early. They needed to expose everything without alerting those responsible for the cover-up. Every time a new leak hit, there were immediate follow-ups. Media outlets from all over the country were picking up the story. But with the heightened attention came increased threats. Derek had received anonymous phone calls warning him to back down. Strangers had followed him around town, lurking in the shadows, their presence a constant reminder of the dangers he was facing. But the worst part wasn't the threats themselves, it was the subtle messages embedded in the media's response. There were whispers suggesting that Derek and Jayden's case were being used as political pawns to push an agenda. The truth was being twisted. They had to act fast. If they didn't, the narrative could slip through their fingers. Derek sat in the small, dimly lit room of their makeshift office, surrounded by papers and digital files. He rubbed his temples, his mind racing. It was all coming to a head. They were about to make their biggest move yet, and every detail had to be flawless. He hadn't spoken to Monica much lately, busy as he was with the investigation, but he knew she was feeling the pressure too. She'd always supported him, but even she had started to question just how far he could go. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Brad. "Brad, it's happening. Sheila's being cornered. They're calling for an investigation into her. This is our shot." Derek's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Sheila had been the central figure in this entire operation, and if they could get her under the microscope, the whole system might start to crumble. But the danger was greater than ever. Sheila wouldn't go down without a fight, she had the connections to protect herself, and she would do everything she could to ensure Derek didn't succeed. He quickly typed a response. "Derek, we move now. We can't waste time. Let's hit them where it hurts." That night, they finalized the plan. Greg, ever the strategist, had suggested a multi-layered approach. The first step would be to release an internal email thread from Sheila herself, one that clearly outlined her direct involvement in the cover-up, as well as her conversations with government officials about the coordinated effort to silence Jayden's case. The second step was to release financial documents linking Sheila to a series of secretive donations made to political campaigns, money that had been funneled through various shell companies to disguise its origins. It wasn't just about racism anymore, this was about corruption at the highest levels. The plan was dangerous. Once they hit send on those final releases, there was no going back. It would expose not only Sheila but the very system that had enabled this kind of corruption to fester for so long. They would need the full weight of public opinion on their side, and they had to make sure that every step was coordinated. Brad would handle the distribution to the media outlets while Greg worked on getting the financial documents into the hands of the right investigative journalists. Derek was tasked with handling the legal side of things, making sure that they were protected in case the backlash came hard and fast. As midnight approached, Derek stood by the window, looking out at the city. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the distant hum of traffic seemed to echo in his ears. He knew that in the morning, everything could change. For better or for worse. His phone buzzed again, this time from Monica. "Monica, I know you're busy, but I wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" He smiled, his heart warming at the message. "Derek, I'm good. It's all coming together. We've got one shot to make this right." She replied almost immediately. "Monica, just be careful, okay? I know you're doing the right thing, but I can feel the pressure mounting. Don't let it consume you." Derek paused for a moment before responding. "Derek, I won't. I promise. I'm doing this for everyone. For Jayden, for the families who've been affected, for all of us. This isn't just about one case anymore. It's about something bigger." At 1 a.m., the message was sent. The story broke within minutes. The leaked emails and financial documents spread across the internet like wildfire. News outlets scrambled to cover it, journalists raced to confirm the details, and social media exploded with opinions, accusations, and demands for answers. The world was watching. The next morning, Derek woke up to a dozen missed calls. He grabbed his phone and saw the news notifications flooding in. Sheila Weston's name was everywhere. The headlines were explosive, but it was the images that hit hardest. There were photographs of her meeting with top government officials, pictures of her at exclusive fundraisers, and even snapshots of her in intimate settings with corporate donors. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a political bombshell. Derek's heart raced as he scanned the messages on his phone. Some were congratulatory. Some were filled with disbelief. And some were from unknown numbers, threatening him in vague, anonymous language. The storm had arrived, and there was no telling what would come next. That afternoon, Derek met with Brad in person, the tension between them palpable. They hadn't seen each other face to face since the plan was set into motion, and both of them knew they were on the brink of something far larger than they had anticipated. "Do you realize what we've just done?" Brad asked, his voice hushed. This changes everything. We've just thrown the entire system into chaos." Derek nodded, his stomach in knots. "I know. But it's not over yet. The truth is out there, but we still have to face the fallout. They won't go down easily." Brad leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his hair. "We've already made enemies of some of the most powerful people in the country. But we've got the public on our side now. They can't ignore us." Derek's phone buzzed again, and he picked it up to see a new notification. "Monica, be careful. I just saw a report. Someone's already trying to discredit you." Derek felt his blood run cold. He had expected this. But seeing it in writing made it feel all the more real. The fight was only just beginning. And now, they were officially in the crosshairs. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. But Derek wasn't about to stop, not when he was so close to the truth. He couldn't turn back now. The truth was finally out. But the question remained, who would be left standing when the dust settled? The next few days felt like a blur to Derek. The storm had not only hit, it had torn through every part of his life. The pressure from the media, the attacks on his character, and the threats that seemed to come from every direction were mounting at a staggering pace. But amidst all the chaos, there was a sense of determination that wouldn't let go. The leaks had worked. The FAA's corruption was finally being exposed. Sheila Weston, once untouchable, was now under the microscope. Public opinion was swaying, and the stories were growing, but it was clear that the forces fighting back were just as determined. It wasn't just the media now, they had come after Derek, too. It started slowly, with the press questioning his motives. Was he just another opportunist looking to capitalize on a racial issue? Was he simply a disgruntled whistleblower looking for revenge? The attacks on his character were insidious, slowly eating away at his credibility. He was portrayed as someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who was putting his own agenda ahead of the truth. Then came the personal threats. Derek had received numerous messages in the middle of the night, some with threats of violence, others with veiled references to his family. It wasn't just an intimidation tactic anymore, it felt like a warning. But the worst blow came from his own colleagues. People Derek had worked with for years, people who once supported him, now turned their backs. They distanced themselves from the scandal, distancing their names from anything associated with the whistleblower's revelations. Some even called him reckless, blaming him for dragging the agency into disrepute. It was as if the walls were closing in, and everyone was scrambling to protect their own interests. Derek sat in his small office, staring at the screen of his laptop, trying to focus. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and for a moment, he questioned if he had done the right thing. The onslaught of negativity was overwhelming. But then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Greg. "Greg, we can't stop now. You're doing the right thing. They're afraid, and that's why they're attacking. We're getting closer. Trust me." Derek looked at the message for a long time, feeling a flicker of hope reignite within him. Greg had been right. This wasn't just about exposing Sheila, it was about exposing the entire system. If they backed down now, everything they had worked for would be in vain. He typed back quickly. Derek, I won't stop. But the pressure is getting to be too much. I don't know how long I can handle it. Greg, you've come this far, Derek. There's no turning back now. Let them come at you. We've got something they can't ignore. Derek knew Greg was right. It wasn't just about the leaks anymore. They were up against an entire system, one built on lies, corruption, and the abuse of power. And now that the system was being exposed, they would do everything they could to discredit the message and silence those responsible for bringing it to light. The next day, Derek attended a small meeting with Brad and Greg to discuss their next move. The room felt heavy with anticipation, but also with a certain quiet resolve. They knew they had to keep pushing forward, no matter what. We've got to go bigger, Greg said as he opened a folder on the table. We need something that will make them sweat. Something they can't ignore. Derek glanced at the papers spread out before him. It was a timeline of events, a map of how everything connected back to the FAA and its ties to government officials. But there was one thing that caught his eye. Hidden within the pages were emails and text messages implicating some of the highest-ranking figures in the country, people with the power to shut down the entire investigation. We've got to leak this, Brad said, looking up at Derek. These documents will tie the government directly into this scandal. If we expose them, it'll be a game changer. The whole narrative will shift. Derek took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he picked up the papers. The documents weren't just dangerous, they were explosive. If they went public, it would blow the roof off everything. But Derek knew it was a risk they had to take. If they didn't expose the full extent of the corruption now, it would be lost forever. Later that evening, Derek sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him. His finger hovered over the send button. The moment he hit it, there would be no turning back. The whole system they had uncovered would be exposed, and the people behind it would come after him with everything they had. He looked out the window once more. The city was quiet now, the streets empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It felt like the calm before the storm. With a deep breath, Derek pressed send. The documents were out. Within hours, the media exploded. Headlines screamed across screens, detailing the government's role in the cover-up. The emails and text messages were everywhere, showing direct involvement from some of the most influential figures in Washington, D.C. The connection to the FAA became clearer than ever before, and the web of corruption was more intricate than they had ever imagined. But it didn't stop there. The backlash was swift and brutal. The government, in full damage control mode, began attacking the story, claiming that the documents were fabricated or taken out of context. They launched investigations into Derek and the other whistleblowers, accusing them of fabricating evidence and trying to destabilize the system. The media frenzy intensified, and the public was divided. Some rallied behind Derek and the team, calling for accountability. Others were skeptical, believing the government's claims of a smear campaign. The battle for public opinion was far from over, and Derek knew they couldn't afford to lose it. The next morning, Derek received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello. Mr. Carter, I suggest you stop. Now, the voice on the other end said, cold and threatening. You have no idea what you're up against. If you keep pushing, you'll lose everything. Derek's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? It doesn't matter. Just know this, if you continue with your investigation, we'll make sure you regret it. You've already gone too far. Turn back before it's too late. The call ended abruptly, and Derek sat in silence, his pulse racing. It was a warning, one he couldn't ignore. But Derek wasn't the kind of man to back down. He knew the risks, and he understood the stakes. The truth was out there now, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him from exposing it. As the days wore on, the attacks only became more personal. Derek's family was targeted. His friends received threats. His professional reputation was smeared. But through it all, he held on to one thing: he couldn't let this system, built on lies and exploitation, stand any longer. He had to keep going. And in the end, no matter how fierce the backlash became, he knew that the truth would come out. It had to. Days had turned into weeks, and Derek was beginning to feel the weight of everything bearing down on him. The media circus surrounding the leaks had not only consumed his professional life, but his personal life had spiraled into chaos. The stress of the situation seemed endless, and every move he made felt like it was being watched by unseen eyes. It was hard to find time for anything else: work, home, or even his own health. Every conversation with his family was strained, and his relationship with Monica had begun to fray at the edges. Derek had always been a man of resilience. But resilience was a fragile thing when it felt like the world itself was unraveling beneath your feet. It had been another sleepless night. Derek sat alone in his apartment, the city lights flickering from the window, casting long shadows across the floor. The only sound was the occasional buzz of his phone, signaling a new email, a new threat, or another reminder that the stakes had grown even higher. There were moments when he felt as if he was drowning in it all: the lies, the deceit, the cover-ups. The corruption that had been festering for so long now felt inescapable. His mind raced as he sifted through the latest batch of documents, desperate for a breakthrough, something that would put an end to the madness. But every document he found seemed to lead to another dead end. The latest revelation, the secret funding from foreign entities that had flowed into FAA programs, was massive. It linked the FAA to international dealings that went against the very values the country claimed to uphold. But Derek had seen firsthand how powerful people could bury evidence when they had enough resources. He was starting to feel like a small man fighting a system far bigger than himself. He reached for his phone to check the messages again. More threats, more warnings. They were closing in. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Derek's heart skipped as he opened the door to find Monica standing there, looking worried but determined. She hadn't been here in days, too consumed with her own life and responsibilities. But now, here she was, looking at him with eyes full of concern. "Hey," she said softly, stepping inside when he motioned her in. "Hey," Derek replied, trying to smile, though it felt forced. "What's going on?" Monica crossed her arms, a look of exhaustion on her face. "I came to check on you. You haven't been answering your calls. I was getting worried." Derek gestured to the clutter around him: files, documents, open laptops, and papers strewn across the table. "I've been busy. Trying to get this all figured out." "Busy?" Monica's voice cracked, and she softened. "Derek, this isn't just work anymore. It's consuming you. It's tearing us apart. You're not eating, you're not sleeping, it's not healthy." Derek looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known, deep down, that he was losing touch with everything he held dear. His obsession with bringing the truth to light had alienated him from the people who mattered most. But it was hard to stop when the stakes were this high. "I can't stop, Monica. They're not just going to walk away because I asked them to," he said, his voice tight. This is bigger than us. It's bigger than just me." "I know," she said, her voice full of emotion. "But you need to know when to stop, Derek. People are hurting, people you care about, and you're losing yourself in this fight. You're becoming someone I don't recognize anymore." Derek felt his throat tighten. "I can't stop. Not now. Not when we're so close." Monica sighed deeply, stepping closer. "I'm not telling you to stop, Derek. I'm telling you to remember who you are. Remember why you started this in the first place. It's not just about the fight, it's about making sure that fight doesn't destroy you in the end." Derek swallowed hard. He felt torn between his duty to the cause and his desire to keep what was left of his personal life intact. But as Monica reached out and placed a hand on his arm, He could feel the emotional toll the battle had taken on both of them. "I'm trying to fix something that's broken, Monica," he said quietly, his voice betraying a moment of vulnerability. "But I don't know if I can do it without losing everything." Monica looked at him, a mixture of sadness and understanding in her eyes. "You don't have to do this alone, Derek. But you can't keep carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I'm here, but you need to be here too. For us. For Jaden. For yourself." Derek stared at her for a long moment, the silence thick with unspoken words. The reality of it all hit him in a way it hadn't before. He had become so consumed by the battle, so wrapped up in fighting for the truth, that he had forgotten the people he was fighting for in the first place. Monica's words cut through the noise in his head. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to rethink his strategy. There had to be a way to win without losing everything. He took a deep breath and turned back to the papers in front of him. But this time, instead of diving right back in, he paused. There was something bigger at play than just the documents, the leaks, and the fight to expose corruption. There was something more important, the relationships he had with the people around him. The next morning, Derek made a decision. He called Brad and Greg to a meeting. They needed to reassess their approach. The leaks were doing their job, but the personal toll was too high. They had to be more strategic, more careful. The fight wasn't over, but it needed to be handled differently. As he prepared for the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The people in power wouldn't just sit back and let this investigation continue without a fight. They would retaliate. But Derek was ready for that. He had already taken the first step, he was no longer willing to fight alone. The next phase of the investigation would not only expose the corruption but also protect the people he loved. But in the back of his mind, Derek knew that whatever came next, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Derek sat at the conference table, his hands folded in front of him. The weight of the situation was clear in his eyes, he had seen the headlines, the threats, and the growing pressure. Every day felt like it was pushing him closer to a breaking point. But now, with the support of Monica and the resolve to move forward carefully, he was determined to take control. Brad and Greg sat across from him, both watching him closely. There was no longer any pretense of calm, the urgency was apparent in the air. They had all come to the same conclusion, it was time for a new strategy. Derek couldn't continue to fight this battle on his own, nor could they keep leaking documents without considering the fallout. They needed a carefully orchestrated plan, one that would keep them in the game, without exposing them to further personal harm. "We need to be strategic about this next move," Derek said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, though the exhaustion was evident in his features. "We've caused a stir, but now we're facing a retaliation from people with a lot of power. If we don't plan the next step carefully, we risk everything." Greg nodded, his fingers tapping the table in thought. "I agree. We've stirred the pot, but now we need to keep up the momentum. We need to pull in some allies, someone who has access to the corridors of power, someone who can help us get the right people to pay attention." Brad leaned forward, his eyes bright with a spark of hope. "We can't just rely on the media anymore. We need concrete action. But we also have to stay smart, there are too many moving pieces, too many powerful people with stakes in this." Derek exhaled slowly, feeling the pressure building up. "We need to go to the people. To the public. We need to make sure that the media frenzy doesn't die down, but also make sure that we're not just chasing headlines. This isn't about creating noise, it's about creating change. And for that, we need someone who can help make real moves behind the scenes." Greg was the first to speak. "I know someone. I've been in touch with a reporter, someone with enough influence to cut through the red tape and actually get the government's attention. But she won't go public unless we can give her something substantial." Derek nodded. "What are we looking at?" "We need to make sure we're giving her something that will bring real pressure to bear on the people in power. Otherwise, it's just another leak. Greg hesitated, but Derek could see the gears turning in his friend's head. I have access to one last piece of the puzzle. A document that connects FAA corruption directly to a significant government official, someone who can't afford to be exposed. I've been working on getting this verified, but if it's true, it could change everything. We use it as leverage. Derek's eyes narrowed. A government official? Who are we talking about here? Greg leaned back in his chair, a serious expression settling over his face. A senior congressman with ties to the FAA. Someone with enough political sway to keep this whole thing under wraps for years. If we can bring him into the light, it could be the game changer we need. Derek felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. If the document Greg was referring to had the power to do what he said it could, it would put everything they had worked for at risk, but it could also break the case wide open. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. Alright, what do we need to do to move forward with this? Greg quickly outlined a plan. First, they needed to have the document authenticated by independent sources to ensure its legitimacy. Once that was done, they would meet with the journalist Greg had in mind, someone who had broken major stories in the past but was careful about her sources. After that, it would be a matter of timing and ensuring that the document was made public at the right moment, when the public was most receptive to the truth. But there was one catch: they couldn't afford any more mistakes. One wrong move, and the whole plan could fall apart. Later that evening, Derek found himself in front of a computer screen again, scrolling through the various files they had collected. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Monica earlier. Her words were still echoing in his head, reminding him of the personal cost of this investigation. But as he looked at the paper trail in front of him, Derek knew that there was no going back. The leaks had already set the stage, and the damage had been done. But now, they were getting closer to something bigger than they had ever imagined. And if they could pull this off, the people responsible for the corruption at the heart of the FAA and the government would have no choice but to answer. The following days were a whirlwind. Derek worked tirelessly with Greg to authenticate the documents, making sure that every piece of information was verified and cross-checked. Meanwhile, Brad worked behind the scenes, reaching out to contacts who might have information about the congressman Greg had mentioned. They had to be sure that the information they were about to leak was airtight. The tension in the air was palpable as they gathered in the same conference room once again. The clock was ticking, and they could feel the pressure of time weighing on them. The press was circling like vultures, and the threats against Derek and his family were increasing. "This is it," Derek said, taking a deep breath as he looked at Greg and Brad. "Once we do this, there's no turning back." Greg met his gaze. "We're ready, Derek. We've got everything lined up. This could be the end of it, or it could be the beginning of a whole new fight. But we've come this far, and we can't stop now." Brad nodded, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a somber look. "We've been through a lot. But this is our shot." Derek felt a surge of determination. He knew the risks, but he also knew that the truth had to come out. If they were going to expose the corruption, they had to give it everything they had. Later that night, the final pieces fell into place. The document was verified, the journalist was briefed, and the story was ready to go live. Derek stood at the window, staring out at the city, his mind racing. They were about to make history. But at what cost? The morning sun barely pierced the gloom that had settled over Derek's apartment, casting long shadows across the room. The silence was suffocating, and for a moment, he wondered if it was all worth it, the sleepless nights, the secrets, the constant fear that someone would find out what they were up to. The calm before the storm was always the most nerve-wracking. Derek took a deep breath and stared at the screen of his phone. The journalist Greg had arranged to meet was scheduled to release the story today. It was going to hit the press with full force. He knew it was time. There was no turning back now. But even so, something inside him twisted with unease. The reality of the situation, what it would mean for his family, his career, and his own future, hit him harder than ever. "Here we go," he muttered to himself, pressing the button to send the final email. It was time to set everything in motion. By the time the press release went live, Derek was already sitting in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The first shockwave had been sent out. The headline alone would send a ripple through the media, forcing them to take a closer look. The truth about the FAA corruption scandal was about to break open in a way no one had expected. The document, the one Greg had uncovered, had revealed the congressman's involvement. The ties were clear: illicit funding funneled through the FAA to various projects, all with the goal of furthering a personal agenda. The man was in bed with contractors, lobbyists, and foreign entities, all of whom benefited from the scandal in one way or another. The public wouldn't be able to ignore it once the story was fully out. Derek glanced at his phone once more. It buzzed with messages from Brad, but he couldn't bring himself to open them yet. Everything felt like it was happening too fast, and he was beginning to question whether they were truly ready for the consequences. He drove aimlessly for a while, trying to clear his mind. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Monica. He stared at the screen, his heart sinking. The last few weeks had strained their relationship, but he knew deep down that she needed him just as much as he needed her. He had been so consumed by the investigation, he hadn't even noticed how much he was pulling away from the people he loved. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. "Derek? Where are you?" Monica's voice was thick with worry. "I'm just driving," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "The story's out. Everything's in motion." Monica let out a breath, but it didn't sound like relief. "I saw the headlines." "Derek, you've done it. But, are you ready for what's coming next?" The question echoed in his mind, and for the first time in days, Derek felt a rush of doubt. Was he ready? Had they thought this through enough? "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's too late to stop now." Monica was quiet for a long time, and Derek could almost feel the weight of her gaze on him through the phone. "Just, don't lose yourself in this, okay? I can't lose you too." Her words hit him harder than anything else. He had been so caught up in exposing the truth that he had forgotten what it meant to live with it. The truth didn't come without consequences, and Derek knew that he would have to face those consequences, whether he was ready or not. By the time Derek arrived back at his apartment, the media frenzy had already begun. Social media was flooded with posts about the leaked documents, the connections to the powerful congressman, and the public outrage that had started to build. The news outlets were scrambling to report on the story, piecing together the fragments of the scandal. But there was one thing Derek hadn't anticipated: the backlash had started to come faster than he expected. He opened his email to find dozens of angry messages, threats, and demands for answers. Most of the messages were from anonymous accounts, people whose voices had become louder and louder in the last few days. But there were a few, buried in the chaos, that stood out. One message, from an unknown number, made Derek's blood run cold. "You've made a terrible mistake. If you don't shut this down, you'll regret it." It wasn't the first threat he'd received, but there was something different about this one. The phrasing was more personal, the tone colder. And it was signed off with a single word: goodbye. Derek immediately forwarded the message to Brad and Greg, but the knot in his stomach remained. Someone was watching them. Someone who had the power to make things dangerous for them. Within hours, the full weight of the scandal hit. The public outcry was deafening. People were demanding answers, the congressman was being investigated, and the FAA was scrambling to contain the fallout. Derek had expected this kind of reaction, but the magnitude of it was overwhelming. The entire system was being shaken to its core, and now there was no turning back. But with the chaos came something else, something Derek hadn't accounted for. The media began focusing not just on the truth, but on Derek himself. They were painting him as a hero, but also as a target. And the stories weren't kind. Man behind FAA scandal leak, hero or traitor? FAA investigator under attack, is Derek Miller the next target? Derek read through the articles in silence. He wasn't sure which one he feared more, being labeled a hero or a traitor. Both brought danger, but the latter had far more weight in the world of politics and power. A few hours later, Brad called him, voice tight. The congressman's people are starting to come after us. We need to be careful, Derek. This thing is getting too big, too fast. I know, Derek replied, his voice low. I can feel it too. But we've exposed the truth. And we can't let them bury it again. There was a pause on the other end of the line. We've exposed part of the truth, Brad said. But the people behind this, they're bigger than we realized. Derek's heart dropped. He knew exactly what Brad was getting at. The congressman was just a puppet. And the people pulling the strings? They were the ones who truly held the power. And now, it was clear, they were coming for him. Derek paced back and forth in his apartment, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The threats, the media frenzy, the overwhelming pressure, it was all too much. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone once more, checking the latest notifications. The calls were relentless now, mostly from unknown numbers. Some were from reporters, some from anonymous sources, and others from people trying to silence him. There was no peace, no escape. The battle he had set in motion had gone far beyond anything he could have anticipated. The congressman was just one piece of the puzzle, and Derek knew he couldn't rest until the whole truth came to light. But now, as the storm of backlash gathered, he wondered if he'd even be alive to see it through. He rubbed his face, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. It had been days without sleep, without a moment to himself. He had turned into a man on the edge, consumed by his mission, pushing everything else aside, including Monica. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Greg, marked urgent. We need to talk. I have information that changes everything. Meet me at the usual place. Now. Derek's heart skipped a beat. Greg's messages had become more cryptic over the past few days, and this one was no exception. But whatever it was, Derek knew it was time to move forward. If they were going to survive this, they needed every piece of information they could get. A short drive later, Derek arrived at the small, dimly lit coffee shop where he had first met Greg. The place hadn't changed much, and the familiar hum of the espresso machine did little to calm his nerves. He spotted Greg sitting in the back corner, hunched over a laptop, his face tense with concentration. Derek slid into the chair across from him without a word. Greg didn't look up immediately. Instead, he typed something on his laptop before finally glancing up, his eyes dark with concern. Derek, we've got a problem, he said quietly. Derek leaned in, his pulse quickening. What kind of problem? Greg hesitated before speaking. I've been looking into the people behind this whole thing, the ones pulling the strings. And it's worse than we thought. The congressman's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a much bigger organization at play here. They're tied to defense contracts, private security, and... Hold on, Derek interrupted, his mind racing. Are you saying it's not just politics? That there's a bigger operation at play here? Greg nodded grimly. Yes. And they have ties to people we haven't even begun to understand. If we expose this, they won't just come after us, they'll come after everyone in our lives. Monica, your family. Derek's stomach dropped. This was the nightmare he had feared from the start. He had wanted to expose the truth, but now he saw the full scale of what they were up against. What do we do? Derek asked, his voice hoarse. We need more leverage, Greg said, tapping a few keys on the laptop. I've been digging into some of the financial records connected to these people. There's a trail. A big one. But we need to move quickly before they figure out what we're doing. Derek's mind raced. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with every passing second. This wasn't just about the FAA anymore. It wasn't just about politics. This was something far more dangerous, and they were playing with fire. "We can't back down," Derek said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We've come this far. We need to finish what we started." Greg's eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "You're right. But we can't do it alone. We need help, real help." Derek clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing. "Who can we trust?" "I have a few people in mind," Greg said slowly. "But they're not easy to reach. We're going to need to go underground. Lay low for a while, and then make our move." Derek stared at Greg, trying to process what he was hearing. He knew this was bigger than they'd imagined, but the idea of going into hiding, of risking even more, was terrifying. But there was no other choice. Not now. The next few days were a blur of frantic planning and late-night meetings. Derek found himself moving in and out of safe houses, exchanging encrypted messages, and trying to make sense of the mess they had gotten themselves into. The world felt like it was closing in on him. The more they uncovered, the deeper the conspiracy seemed to go. It wasn't just about corruption at the FAA anymore. It was about power, control, and a network of people who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. Derek's only comfort came from the fact that they were finally close to something that could bring it all to light. But he had no illusions about what that would mean. He was about to make a powerful enemy. On the fourth night after their meeting, Derek found himself standing in front of a small, nondescript building in a quiet part of town. Greg had arranged a meeting with one of his sources, someone who had connections to the people behind the corruption. This was their chance to get the final piece of the puzzle. As Derek entered the building, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like it was echoing too loudly in the stillness. He met with the source in a back room, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of confidence. She didn't say much at first, just handed Derek a file thick with documents and photos. Derek opened the folder, scanning the contents quickly. His heart began to race as he realized what he was looking at: records, emails, and contracts that tied the corruption directly to multiple high-ranking officials, not just in the FAA but in other government sectors as well. This wasn't just about politics anymore. This was about systemic corruption at the highest levels. The woman spoke quietly, her voice low and measured. "This is it. With this, you can bring down the whole operation. But be warned, this isn't just about power. It's about survival. If you go public with this, they will destroy you." Derek felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't ready for this. But he knew there was no turning back now. He looked up at the woman, his resolve hardening. "Then let them come." As he left the building, clutching the folder in his hand, Derek's thoughts raced. He had what he needed. The truth was finally in his grasp. But the question remained, was he ready for the consequences? The storm had finally hit. Derek felt it in his bones, the crushing weight of what was coming next. The final piece of the puzzle was in his hands. The information he had obtained from the source, the files that could topple the entire system, were now the most dangerous thing he'd ever carried. Every second he spent holding them felt like an eternity, and every moment he spent alive, walking among the shadows, felt like it could be his last. He couldn't even remember the last time he had slept properly. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the investigation, of the people who would stop at nothing to silence him, of Monica, of everything that was on the line. This was no longer just about exposing corruption, it was about surviving long enough to do it. He had no illusions left. He knew what was coming. And it was coming for him. As Derek entered his apartment, the familiar surroundings did nothing to ease his nerves. The walls that had once felt like a haven now felt like a trap. The buzz of his phone broke the silence. He stared at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw who was calling: Monica. It had been days since they had really spoken. He had pushed her to the sidelines, consumed by the investigation. But now, hearing her voice on the other end of the line, he felt a pang of guilt. "Hey," he said, his voice sounding too calm. "Derek," Monica's voice trembled, even though she was trying to sound composed. I saw the news. I don't know what's going on, but I feel like I'm losing you. You've been shutting me out." Derek's stomach churned. He wanted to reach out, to tell her everything. But even as he stood there, holding the weight of the information that could ruin everything, he couldn't bring himself to tell her the full truth. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm doing what I have to do. There's no turning back now. You're scaring me, Derek. Please, be careful. Whatever you're doing, it's bigger than us, and I don't want to lose you in this fight. You need to come back to me." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Derek closed his eyes, feeling the pain of what he had become. He had never meant for it to go this far. "I don't want to lose you either," he replied, his voice strained. "But I need to finish this, Monica. It's the only way to make sure this doesn't keep happening to people, doesn't keep happening to you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but there was a sadness that Derek had never heard before. "Please, promise me that no matter what happens, you'll come back to me. We'll figure it out together. Don't let them take everything from us." He felt his resolve waver. He wanted to promise her. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that he would make it through this, but deep down, he knew the risks were too great. And the people behind the corruption were too powerful. "I can't promise you that," he said, his voice raw. "But I will do everything I can to come back. I swear it." The next few hours were a blur of frantic phone calls, encrypted messages, and a few final meetings. Derek knew the information he held was too valuable, too dangerous, to let slip into the wrong hands. But it was also his only hope to bring the truth to light. He and Greg had devised a plan, risky, dangerous, but it was the only way forward. They would release the documents to the press. The story would break wide open, and the world would know the truth about the corruption at the highest levels of government. But that wouldn't be enough. Derek knew that. The people behind this wouldn't let it go without a fight. It was time to go public. But even as he typed out the final press release, he felt the weight of his decision. If he went through with this, it would be the end of any semblance of normal life he had known. The following morning, Derek sat in front of his computer, hands trembling slightly as he hit send. He stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the media storm to begin. Within minutes, the news broke. Headlines across the country flashed with the truth. The corruption in the FAA, the congressman's involvement, the deep ties to private contractors, it was all out in the open. Derek's phone buzzed non-stop. Messages flooded in. But there was one that stood out. A single, ominous text from an unknown number. "You've made a grave mistake. This isn't over. You won't survive this." Derek's blood ran cold. He knew what this meant. They were coming for him. But he had made his choice. There was no turning back now. Hours passed, and the media frenzy intensified. The story was everywhere. Public figures were demanding answers, investigations were being launched, and the pressure was mounting. But for Derek, the worst was yet to come. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the doorbell rang. Derek froze, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone. The room felt suddenly colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. It was Greg. "Derek, open up. We need to talk," Greg's voice came through the door, tense and urgent. Derek unlocked the door, and Greg stepped inside quickly, his face pale. "They know," Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. The people we're up against, they know everything. We need to get out of here. Now. Derek's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean, they know? They've been tracking us. Watching every move we make. They've already taken care of some of our contacts. We don't have much time. Derek didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the folder with the remaining evidence, slipping it into his bag. He had no illusions about the danger he was in. But as he turned to leave, a thought struck him. Monica, Derek started, his voice thick with emotion. I can't leave her behind. Greg met his gaze, understanding. We'll find a way. But first, we need to get to safety. As they hurried to the car, the sound of sirens in the distance sent a chill through Derek. The game had changed. The people they were up against weren't just playing for power, they were playing for survival. And Derek realized, for the first time, that the only way to truly win this fight was to stay one step ahead of those who would stop at nothing to silence him. The battle had just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?